Welcome to the NNJR Trackside Classroom Series. In this series of videos, we talk about a variety of the various and most important topics on track. And today we're going to talk about proper track braking technique. As you see from the quote from Mario Andretti and lots of other quotes, braking is really at the heart of learning how to drive well on track. Today's session is targeted for student drivers, although I'm sure all drivers will find some useful ideas here. But as always, before we get started, the caveat that everything that we've put in here we think is good advice, but you use it at your own risk. Just like when we're on track, everything we do is at our own risk. So with that said, let's dive right in. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to briefly talk about the learning sequence. In other words, the proper way to focus and to prioritize when we're on track. Then we're going to kind of take braking apart a little bit and look at what the corner entry steps are, talk specifically about braking, and we'll use some Watkins Glen examples today, but these techniques apply to any track. So there's nothing specific to Watkins Glen here other than a couple of examples. And at the bottom, a Ross Bentley quote that's really probably more applicable to those of you with more experience, but braking is where the difference exists between the really good drivers and the rest. So with that said, let's get going. So this is what I've called the learning sequence, but it's the sequence of priorities when you're learning a track, when you're learning a corner, or even trying to get better. So what that means is that if you're a new driver, you're going to mainly focus on learning the line. And until you get the line figured out, everything else is really secondary. Once we have the line, then we want to maximize our exit speed out of the corner consistent with safety. And that to do that, we find the best point to get on the gas, the throttle application point, and the best point to put our foot on the floor, the wide open throttle. And then if we're learning, the last thing we work on is braking and entering the turn. So while we're talking about braking today, as if it's the only topic, it's not. In the sequence of learning, it is less important. But that said, as you are learning and you've kind of got the line figured out, there are some braking techniques. Well, let me say it differently. There are some common mistakes that we'll explain how to avoid, and that will help you learn faster when you're on track. So some basics that I don't want to overlook. Have to be seated properly so that you can press on that brake pedal hard with a lot of force. And that means your leg cannot be straight. You cannot be reaching, cannot be using your foot or your ankle. Have to be using the big muscles in the leg. For that to work, there has to be some bend in the knee, even when you're pressing hard on the brake pedal. So make sure you're close enough that you're not reaching on the brake pedal. Second, the right heel should stay on the floor. It should pivot between the gas pedal and the brake pedal. And that's something a lot of people don't do. If you're picking your foot up from the gas pedal to the brake pedal, A, that is slower, but B, it's not as consistent or predictable. And so you want to get in the habit of just pivoting your heel on the floor. I tried to find a picture from my 968 of the metal floorboard that was in it. It was painted black, but the paint had worn off where my heel had been on the floor as I was driving the car, just to make the point. So other basics, you're going to look for a point to begin braking, but as a beginner, you will be approaching each corner at different speeds. And so, so that's a factor as well. And then heel and toe. If you have a manual transmission, we can't teach you how to heel and toe on track. You have to learn that on the street. And obviously, when we're braking, if we're downshifting at the same time, the heel and toe needs to be done in a way it doesn't affect that brake effort. And that's much easier to say than it is to do. It requires lots of practice. So let's kind of break down the steps involved as we think about getting on the brakes. We're coming down a straightaway. We're going to take our foot off the gas, put it on the brake. Then we're going to brake in a straight line. And then at some point, we're going to turn in, and we're going to probably still have some brake effort, some brake pressure, our foot still on the brake pedal. And there's a fancy word for that called trail braking, but you do that naturally now. We all do that naturally on the street. If we're slowing down for a corner to pull into your neighborhood street, you don't think, gee, I'm trail braking into this corner. We just naturally have the brakes on as we turn the corner. And that's what we're going to do on the track as well. The amount that we're going to use, the amount of brake and how long it's going to be on, that's where the magic is. And that's what we'll spend a little bit of time talking about. And then last, we're going to take our foot off the brakes and go to the gas. And that is the brake release that Ross Bentley's talking about at the bottom here. That's where even pros practice getting better at that. So that's a really important part of the process. So let's use some visuals to make this a little more real. Here's turn one at Watkins Glen. For sake of illustration, let's assume you've decided, we're going to brake at the 400-foot mark. Nice and easy reference, hard to miss. So we're going to, by begin braking, we're actually just moving our foot off the gas onto the brake pedal, right? And then we're going to, once our foot's on the pedal, we're going to brake in a straight line. And at some point, obviously, we're going to reach the turn in, and we're still going to be on some brake. But after we turn in, at some point before the apex, we're going to take our foot off the brake pedal and start to move it toward the gas pedal, so that by the time we are at the apex, we can start to use the gas. So pretty simple, right? Well, let's break that down a little bit. Here's how one way that we could apply the brakes. We could get on the brakes, sort of gently, and then more effort, and then full effort, and then kind of just get off the brakes. Well, that's not the recommended way to do it. Another way that's not recommended is you jump on the brakes, full brake effort, jump off the brakes. And by the way, this is a very common beginner mistake, and we'll say more about that. This less so, but not a good idea. This is what we want the brake effort generally to look like in a heavy braking zone. We want to get on the brakes and immediately apply, lots of pressure, keep that for a little while, and then trail that off. And we're going to turn in someplace, in this range here. So what are some of the common mistakes? Well, I already mentioned the too little pressure early, too much late. That was the one graph you just saw. Another one is to jump on and off the brake pedal. as opposed to the proper technique is to put the foot on the brake pedal from the gas pedal quickly and press until we feel pressure and then press hard. And that little bit of delay, that little bit of pressing allows the car to squat down nicely and stop using the effort of all four tires, as compared to if we just jump on the brake pedal, we're going to push all the weight forward and we're going to force the front tires to do all the work, and the back tires won't be able to help as much. And then I also mentioned here inconsistent braking point, as well as inconsistent amount of braking. That's something that is almost every new driver needs to get better at. Now, those of you that have some experience, you still often make some of these mistakes. Not to the same extent, but the too little pressure early, too much late, that happens even with advanced drivers sometimes. It takes effort to break that habit. And another habit we see with experienced drivers is at the end of the braking, going from a heavy brake effort straight to a heavy gas effort. And that obviously upsets the car. It's not the fast, or by the way, not the safe way to enter a corner. And a common mistake is to think that braking is all about braking hard and late, when in fact braking late is the last thing anyone should ever work on. And I always tell people we can brake 10 or even 20 feet earlier and be much smoother and much nicer to the car, and by the way, much faster. So let's talk a little bit about braking at Watkins Glen as an example. Watkins Glen has no slow corners, so some tracks do, and they have their own characteristic, mainly that they need a lot of trail braking. We're going to brake a long ways into a corner. Well, we're going to do some trail braking at Watkins Glen, but not because it's slow. It is a high speed track. That means we have heavy brake zones in turn 1 and the bus stop, even turn 8. Those are heavy brake zones. Most tracks have at least one heavy brake zone. Watkins Glen, depending on how you count them, is a minimum 2 and maybe 3 or more. Trail braking. Well, some corners of Watkins Glen, we are going to carry the brakes partway into the corner. If you look on the map here for turn 6, it's a long corner. Also happens to be downhill. So we're going to carry the brakes partway into the corner. Turn 8, sharp corner. Turn 9, equally sharp. Those corners, we're going to carry the brakes in a ways because, the apex is a long ways around, and it won't do us any good to get on the gas early. So we're going to carry the brakes. And the bus stop is the same thing. And elevation at all tracks, but particularly Watkins Glen, where there's some steep hills, really helps and hurts the braking. In turn 6, I already mentioned, is downhill. Turn 7 is even sharper than, I'm sorry, what happened here? Turn 7 is even sharper, but it has less trail braking because it's uphill, very steeply uphill. And so the hill grabs the car and we don't have to do much braking after, very long after we turn in. In contrast, we have turns 10 and 11, which are fast corners that require very little trail braking. In other words, most of the braking we're going to do is in a straight line. And in all fast corners, we want to do gentle braking to avoid upsetting the car. So now let's think about a way to mentally program our thinking and eventually our right foot so that we can improve our braking. And the way that we like to do that is to think about brake pressure. In other words, how hard am I pressing on the brake pedal? As 0, meaning I'm not on the brake pedal, no effort, to 10, where I press hard enough that I activate the ABS, or if I don't have ABS, I lock up the front tires. And so the maximum stopping effort actually happens at just before ABS lockup. So call it 9.5, actually 9.9, but in any case, full brake effort is let's call it a 9 or 9.5. So if we are in a hard braking zone, like turn 1 at Watkins Glen or Lightning or Thunderbolt or fill in the blank, here's a way to think about how we should use the brakes. Once we're on the brakes, as I described earlier, not jumping on them, but on them quickly, pressure, full pressure, right up to a 9. And we're going to stay at that 9, for a while, maybe even longer than I've shown here, but we're going to stay there for a while. But eventually, we're going to, start to taper that off. This is a long brake zone. And by the time we get to the turn in, maybe we're at a 2 or 2.5. And then eventually, as we get, halfway to the apex, we're going to come off the brake pedal. And as you saw in the graphs earlier, this is the opposite of our natural tendency. And the reason it's the opposite of our natural tendency is that on the street, we do the reverse. If we're approaching a stop sign or even a corner, a street corner, we'll get on the brakes relatively gently. And then as we approach the corner and need to slow down more, we'll apply a little more brake pressure. Well, we have to break ourselves of that habit when we're on the track. It's a good habit on the street, bad habit on the track. So this is one of those things that beginners struggle with a bit until they realize how well it works to actually use the brakes hard in the initial part of the brake zone. Now, on the other hand, in a fast corner like turn 10 or turn 11 at Watkins Glen, as I said before, we don't want to upset the car. Also, they're fast corners, meaning we don't have to slow down as much either. So we're going to initially apply the brakes as a 3, a 2 or a 3, whatever, in that range. And we're going to do that for some long distance. Some people call this brush braking. Regardless of what you call it, we're braking much earlier than we would have to, and much lighter. And we're doing that because we're just trying to slow the car a little bit, but we're trying to do it without upsetting the car. And furthermore, we're going to turn in with almost no brake on, just a little bit, half, let's call it, because that in almost every car, we want that little bit of extra weight on the front as we turn in to help the car turn in. But very quickly after we turn in, we're going to trail off to no brake effort. So think about this 0 to 10 scale, and it'll help you communicate with your instructor, to improve your braking. Now, as you get better, you can think about the end of braking. In other words, the point where your foot comes off the brake pedal. And as you get more experience, you're going to find that the end of braking is more important than the beginning of braking. And a key point to focus on being consistent. Now, if you're not quite ready for that, and it is something that takes quite a bit of experience, then I strongly recommend those of you in yellow and blue focus on how much brake pressure do you have when you turn in, and focus on making that consistent, so that if I'm trying to turn in at a brake pressure of a 3 at turn 1 at Watkins Glen, then let's try to make it a 3 on every lap, whatever your particular objective is, but let's make it consistent. And that will pay you big dividends as you move to transition from the gas to, from the brake to the gas. So let's take our turn one example again, and now let's overlay, what the brake pressure, looks like, from a real, from a real braking zone. So this is a real brake pressure trace, from the brake zone at turn one. Exactly where the arrows are is approximately right, may not be exactly precise, but as we showed before, if we begin braking at 400, that really isn't our beginning a braking point. Yes, we tell ourselves it is, but really our foot should have been on the floor until this point. So it's really the accelerate to point. Thank you, Peter Krause, for that term, which means as you look at the red arrow and the brake pressure, at the moment where we decide to begin our braking, there is no brake pressure because our foot's moving just came off the gas pedal and is moving to the brake pedal. So the car is going to travel a little ways before we start to get some brakes. So, down the track a little bit, now there is brake pressure being ramped up because the foot is now on the brake pedal and is pressing. And by the time we're into the brake zone, now, lots of brake pressure. It's not a perfectly flat line because most of us aren't quite that good with the brake pedal, but, you see very heavy brake pressure for a long ways in the brake zone here. And that's exactly what we would expect to see in a braking zone like this one at Watkins Glen. But at some point, obviously, we have to prepare to turn in. We're not at the turn in yet, but we have to get ready. And that means the brake pressure is going to need to start to trail off. And that's now we're now well into the brake zone, and we're thinking about getting ready to turn in. And just as importantly, if you have a manual transmission car, this is the point where we're going to downshift. And I mentioned the heel and toe before, but the downshifts shouldn't happen early. They should happen late in the brake zone, but before the turn-in point, so that all of the effort associated with the downshift is completed before the turn-in point. So, so this last part of the brake zone can be quite busy if we're downshifting and getting ready to turn in. And of course, when we do get to the turn-in point, we're still on some brake pressure, right? You see the red arrow as to approximately where we are here. And that shows us kind of that 2.5 or 3, that kind of effort we talked about before at turn-in. And then when we get to the end of braking, now the brake effort is down again to 0, and you notice a nice gentle trail off of the brake pressure as we're trying to make the transition from the brake pedal to the gas pedal nice and smooth. So, with all that said, let me just summarize. What we've just talked about. It's really important to learn the proper track braking technique, the basics, the seating position, the heel pivot. Your instructor will work with you on that, but if you're new, those are really important to get nailed from the beginning. And learning the hard initial brake, gentle release that I've emphasized here, that's that again, if you're a beginner, that's something to really focus on. If you have experience, you need to continue to focus on making sure you're consistent at it and work on that gentle release part. And a way to think about the brake zone, and this came from one of our guest pro speakers, he said, think about the brake zone in thirds. The first third is for slowing the car. Most of the braking is going to happen in that third. And while that literally may or may not be true, it is conceptually true. And in actual fact, a very large proportion of the slowing does happen early in the brake zone. He said the second third is for downshifts and getting ready to turn in. And the last third is for coming off the brakes. So, if you're a beginner, that may or may not compute, but if you have some experience, that should compute. And either way, this is another way to reinforce why it's important to use that strong brake effort early to get the car slowed. The amount of trail braking, in other words, how far we carry the brakes into a particular corner and how much brake, varies a lot by each corner and each track. It's affected by elevation, corner length. Generally, the general rule is the longer the corner or the sharper the corner, the more trail brake. But that can be affected dramatically by elevation. And as you get better, as I mentioned, focus on the end of braking, not the beginning of braking. Work on that smooth transition off the brake onto the gas. The goal is so that if I were to ride with you, I couldn't tell when your foot came off the brake pedal and got on the gas pedal. And by the way, that aspect of braking, you can practice on the street. Can practice coming up to a stop sign and gently, feathering the brake effort down so that the front end of the car doesn't pop up, when you stop. I mean, most people come rolling up to a stop sign, hit the brakes hard, car bounces on the front suspension a little bit. Well, try to do it so that doesn't happen, or that you minimize that. That will improve the sensitivity in your right foot. That'll pay big dividends on the track. With all that said, thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing you at the track. I always welcome your questions and comments and feedback. You can email me at gilbert4@rcn.com or come see me at the track. And like I said, always look forward to hearing your feedback and your suggestions. Everyone have a great day. I will see you at the track.